Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College, a program that invites you into discussions taking place in your community on today's local and global issues. Now, your host for Conversations from St. Norbert College, the Dean and Academic Vice President of the college, Michael Marsden. Good evening, and welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College. I'm Mike Counter, sitting in for your host, Michael Marsden. Tonight, our focus will be on the changing times of the newspaper industry. Our special guests are Thomas Kunkel, who is in his first year as president of St. Norbert College, and John Dye, executive editor of the Green Bay Press Gazette. President Kunkel spent many years in newspaper management. He was deputy managing editor of the San Jose Mercury News. Prior to that, he worked for the Miami Herald, the New York Times, and the Cincinnati Post, and he was editor and publisher of Arizona Trend magazine. Kunkel spent 8 years as dean of the Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland before being named St. Norbert College's 7th president effective July of last year. John Dye has been the top editor of the Green Bay Press Gazette, a Gannett daily, since 2004. He has spent more than 30 years in the newspaper business. John has worked at several newspapers and has served as president of State Associated Press editor groups in Ohio, New York, and Wisconsin. Tom and John, glad to have you here.
Thank you, Mike.
You're welcome.
Nice to be here.
Nice to be here is right. Changing times we live in, too.
Sure.
Well, Tom, I want to start with you. You worked on a project on the State of the American newspaper, a 2-year in-depth examination of the newspaper industry. Could you talk about that project a little bit and tell us what you found?
I did. It was a wonderful project. It took me to the University of Maryland, where I subsequently became dean, so it was a great time, and it was an important project. Basically, the idea was to get some of the best journalists in the country to take really deep, specific looks at different aspects of the newspaper industry, because even then, 10 years ago, we knew that the newspaper industry was at an important turning point. Mm-hmm. And we wanted to see, what are the changes that are happening, what are the factors, and what does it all mean, where is it going as an industry? And I was overseeing that project. And a couple of the things, some of the headlines that we found, actually, I think, we're now seeing the culmination of some of that in the changes that we're seeing in the newspaper industry today. For instance, we wrote extensively about the growing trend of newspapers to be bought and sold and increasingly purchased by big newspaper companies or chains, which is, neither good nor bad, depends on the company. But what you were seeing was an increasing emphasis on bottom line performance, the financial performance. Mm-hmm. And so companies, there was much more pressure on newsrooms to, reduce staff and cut back on news hole and things like that. And so you also in turn saw that, across the country, fewer reporters were covering state government, fewer reporters were covering federal government, that kind of thing, worrisome trends like that. We also wrote a lot about sort of what was then the emerging digital media environment. And at the time, the newspaper industry, just regarded it primarily as competition, was more afraid of it, didn't really know how to respond to it, rather than adapt it and co-opt it. At first, it tried to stiff-arm it. It subsequently, did sort of make its peace and try to use the digital environment with varying degrees of success. But a lot of what we wrote about 10 years ago, these are the factors that are now driving a lot of the changes that, that are in the headlines today in the newspaper industry. So I think the series, did deal a lot with the underlying forces that are culminating now.
Could you talk a little bit about just the cost of high-quality journalism? And doing great journalism is not cheap.
Doing journalism is not cheap, and it never has been. And if I have a single worry about the changing news environment, I have a lot of worries about it. But the single biggest concern I have is exactly that. Watchdog journalism is expensive. It takes talent. It takes experience. It takes knowledge. It takes resources. It takes lawyers. And it takes courage. And whatever you may think about the mainstream media, they're still paying the freight for most of our news. And if what happens in the news environment ends up kneecapping the mainstream media, who's going to pay that bill? Right. I worry about that a lot.
John, recently one of you and one of your colleagues wrote an article in the paper about the changing times of the newspaper industry, and in particular the changes you're going through at the Press Gazette. And although things are struggling in that industry, you alluded to the fact in that article that things aren't quite as bad at the Press Gazette. Could you just talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
And tell us what you meant.
I think the tendency when people make pronouncements about the newspaper industry is to take a big, high overview of the situation, and those predictions, those thoughts about our business don't necessarily look at the lower level. And there are communities, I think, where newspapers are doing much better than they are in others. So what might be happening in a metro area, what might be plaguing the Minneapolis market, for example, isn't necessarily the same situation in Green Bay or northeastern Wisconsin. So our caution was that before people made rash conclusions, jump to conclusions about the newspaper industry, especially about the Green Bay Press Gazette, that we just wanted to reassure people that while we certainly are suffering from some of the impact that's plaguing the newspaper industry everywhere, right. We still are doing well in our community. We still reach a significant number of people. The overwhelming majority of adults in Brown County read our newspaper, and so we're still kicking. We're still thriving. We certainly have made cutbacks. We've made changes, but our overall commitment is still to the quality journalism that President Kunkel alluded to just a second ago. And our efforts have been to try to maintain our resources in that area.
Let's talk about some of the things that are going on in the industry right now. For example, recently the Free Press in Detroit, along with the News, cut home delivery down to 3 days a week. What are your thoughts on that decision? To me, that was a bold move.
Well, I'll start. Everybody that cares about newspapers has strong feelings about, because this is this is sort of cracking open the door that I think everyone has been wondering what's on the other side. I mean, whenever people who aren't in the newspaper business talk to us about where we came from, one of the first questions they ask is, well, how long do you think we'll actually have the newspaper, the paper product, And it's a good question, and the Detroit experiment is, in a sense, and a comparable thing that the Christian Science Monitor is doing. They've migrated almost entirely online. Those are going to start to provide some of the answers to the industry about, how wed people are to, getting the product every day, and how do they respond to the physical product vis-a-vis what they get online. You have to remember that in the newspaper industry, as complicated as it is, there's really only two cost centers. There's people and there's paper. Mm-hmm. And so, frankly, newspaper publishers, if they could see a world where they could get enough advertising revenue just entirely online, it would be nirvana. There'd be no paper, there'd be no presses, there'd be no circulation department, there'd be no trucks, there'd be no gasoline. But the problem is they don't have that environment right now because they can't derive nearly as much revenue online as they can in the good old-fashioned advertisements in the paper. And that's all shaking out. So the Detroit experiment is just that. It's an experiment, and I think it's going to tell the industry some things about, what's going to be acceptable to the market and what's not.
So everybody's watching that closely.
Oh, I agree. I think the newspaper editors and publishers all across the country, and journalists as well, have a sharp focus on that, and we'll want to see in several months whether it was an experiment that worked or failed. So those costs are certainly a factor, and then you have to weigh that against your most loyal, longtime readers feel about having that physical product in their hands every morning. And so Detroit's in an unusual market. It's a rapidly declining economy, plagued, beset by problems in the auto industry, high unemployment. A lot of retail businesses are hurting because of that. So Detroit's situation may be different than, say, Little Rock or some other place. But yet at the same time, I do think there are a lot of people very, very interested in seeing whether that's the right decision to make.
I'd like to add, because John made this point earlier, it's really important for people like the people who are watching this show, are for the most part living in markets, medium to small size markets. When you hear about the newspaper industry, you're tending to hear about what's going on at the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Los Angeles Times or the Chicago Tribune, USA Today. But the fact is, this is a nation of small newspapers. Of the 1,500 or so daily papers, 1,400, are the size of the Press Gazette or smaller. And in the main, the smaller the community, the more stable the newspaper environment tends to be. They're certainly feeling this, a lot of these forces that we talked about earlier and having to deal with them. But consumers should realize that just because something is happening in Detroit or New York, it does not necessarily mean it's going to translate to this market. And in the main, I think changes are less severe and are slower to happen, like where we live, as opposed to Midtown Manhattan.
So, do you think there's a chance of home delivery becoming a thing of the past, or?
I think it's possible that could happen, but I think we're a long way away from that. I think, again, that if you look at this area of Wisconsin, I think there's a lot of independent research that shows that there aren't as many people necessarily tied into the web or walk around with BlackBerries or get their news electronically. When we made changes in the paper recently, and you alluded to those a little while ago, we eliminated television listings and some other things that we thought in the scale of things were easier to trim than, say, trimming a City Hall reporter. We heard from a lot of readers who really spoke to me passionately about their morning ritual and getting the paper every day from the front porch of the Tube and reading the paper and planning their television viewing, for example, or other things by how they use the newspaper. And I think for those people, they're going to expect to see that paper and product delivered to their homes every morning, and it will be a long time before they give up the ghost. Now, my son and my granddaughter, they may get their news in different ways, and I think part of the trick here is how do you, as you migrate from one to the other, how do you make that work? How do you keep enough reporters at City Hall and county government and the State House and the federal agencies and the courts and covering police, serving as watchdogs for the things that are really important for people, and generating enough revenue to make that happen. So I really think that's the key. But I think it would be premature at this point to say, to pick a time on the calendar and say 10 years from now there won't be a newspaper delivered. I really don't think that's going to be the case. It may be that people read the print product more on weekends. The Christian Science Monitor, I think, is going to a weekly product. That might be a model. The paper may be thicker. There may be more pages and more sections on a Saturday and a Sunday when people have more time. And there may be more of a news magazine approach. I think that's one of the models that's been talked about for the daily newspaper. What product, what content is most important in which vehicle, for online versus print. And those are all things, I think, part of what happens in Detroit will be whether they hit that formula right or not. It's not just reducing the number of days, but it's what's in the content, what they do online on the other days, how they serve their readers, and whether their readers respond to that in a positive way, whether the advertisers respond.
In the last 4, 5, 6 years, companies like the one John works with in Green Bay and companies all around the country, newspaper companies, made a very important psychological adjustment. They realized that, they stopped thinking so much about, we're in the newspaper business, and they just realized, we are in the news and information business. Yes, our primary product is this physical, thing that's still printed on paper, but we do all these other things. And the fact of the matter is if we move more into the digital environment, more people are going to migrate. So how do we marry these different products, and how do we make sure that, yes, they may read the paper, but they still want to be online, or what are we providing online that we couldn't do in the paper, and offering a variety of complementary news products. And that's the stage we're in right now, and this is not something that's going to be decided in a year or 3 years. This is going to, wherever that next media model is going to end up, it's going to be a while before we know.
And just to follow up on that, I began my career worrying about whether our competitors would have a story and how we could sit on it for 12 hours and still break it at 6 in the morning when the newspaper landed at your front door. And just in a few years now, the thought is always in my newsroom, first get it up online, get the story up online, and then we'll worry about it for the print cycle later. That's a big psychological shift to make. Just recently, one of my reporters said, do we really want to run this story now, or shouldn't we hold it until after our competitors go to bed, and then we can put it up online at 1 in the morning? and then the paper will come out and we'll still have the story. Well, the fact is that's just really not true, and our online viewers, I think, expect an instant reporting on breaking news, and so that's part of the change. And how you allocate those resources then to do both of those things is really important too. How many reporters and content producers do you assign to online? How many do you maintain to do in-depth reporting? And then the editors, you need to support them. So that's really part of the balancing act, is how do you do both of those things simultaneously.
I just want to go back to the comment you both made about holding the newspaper. I mean, I'm one of those that I like getting my newspaper in the morning. I like holding it. I like the smell. I like reading it. I remember as a kid having a tape recorder, having been in broadcasting and reading into the tape recorder, reading what was written in the paper. I mean, I did that for many years. Do you get a lot of comments from people like,
we do.
I don't want this to go away?
And excuse me, I did bring along a couple of other copies of our front pages recently, just to demonstrate this, I think, because these two editions of our newspaper, one on Monday that focused on Obama and I Have a Dream, with playing with the typography, and then the next day, or 2 days later, with the inauguration, doing both sides of the front of the section. Those papers are selling, in high numbers.
Sure.
Vending machines are empty. Were empty within a few hours. We had to replenish the stock at some of our biggest stores. So when a big event happens in a person's life, whether it's the inauguration of the first black president of the United States or your daughter announcing her engagement, these are the things that get clipped and wrapped in plastic and put in the family cedar chest.
That's right.
And no one yet has figured out a way to take a computer screen and store it in there 30 years from now and pull it out and look at it. So I think that's part of the value of what we do. It's for many communities, and this one in particular, there's a real feeling of connection between what the newspaper reports and how we report it in the lives of our readers. And they expect us to be there to record those events and do it in a dramatic way. What we've been trying to do recently with our front page is to say we're still in the game here. We're still vital. We're still part of your lives, and there are still moments in history and locally or nationally when you look to the newspaper to reaffirm that experience, to record that shared sense. Even though you may have watched the inauguration all day on television, the next morning you still wanted to see it in the newspaper, and this is the thing you'll save, I think.
It's such a generational experience. Three of us being of a certain age, and people that our age and older. This news consumption remains a very tactile experience. Our kids, maybe a little bit, but not so much. Their kids, it's going to be entirely digital. I have a hard time reading a story of any length online. It just doesn't cohere.
Right.
But for the 15-year-old, the reverse is true.
Yeah.
So, again, the news companies made a big psychological leap, and it was sort of counterintuitive for them because, they're having to invest in ways of doing news and presenting it that, don't necessarily come naturally. People have to be retrained, and our brains don't work that way. But they had to do it, even as they kept, that product for the people who wanted it and want it now. Sure. But figuring out those people that, would no sooner, pick up a newspaper than they would,
right.
pick up a container of Mercury, and how do you satisfy everybody? And it's really expensive, as John said.
It's interesting that at the time we were preparing we spent weeks thinking about what our front page was going to be like over these couple of days. And we had a lot of models on the wall, and we were thinking about that. But at the same time, this was going on Tuesday. Our online staff was posting the inaugural speech live, and it was being streamed on our website and being streamed on websites all across the country. In fact, some were crashing because of the high volume. And we had people from Green Bay and surrounding area blogging on their handheld devices and sharing their experiences live as they stood and watched the speech and went to the balls and that kind of thing. They were taking pictures with their cell phones and sending them back to us. And so it was just an interesting thing, a multi-generational approach to covering this thing and interacting with it in a way that I would venture to say if I weren't a newsman, I don't think I'd be sending stories, sharing my experience with someone live about it. But for the teenagers who went, this was really, when we asked them about it, they said, well, sure, great, I'll be doing it to my friends anyway, I'll just add you to my list. Mm-hmm. So we were getting text messages and covering this event then now has become a challenge because we have to think about those in multiple levels and multiple viewers and how they come at that news. So.
I want to remind our viewers, you're watching Conversations from St. Norbert College. Our focus is on the changing times of the newspaper industry, and we are being joined by St. Norbert College President Thomas Kunkel and John Dye, Executive Editor of the Green Bay Press Gazette. Let's look ahead, guys. What will the newspaper industry and journalism look like in 10 years from now, in your opinions?
Yeah, John, what does it look like?
I wish I knew. My hope and my belief is that there's still going to be value in the reporters who pound the pavement, so to speak, who go to the council meetings, who ask questions at City Hall, who are sitting in courtrooms as people's lives are at stake. I mean, I think that's our really fundamental mission. And my sense is we'll still be doing that. And that the means about how we do it, I don't really think matters. I mean, it's important in the short term, but in the long term, the real fundamental importance here is continuing to serve people and serve that watchdog First Amendment responsibility that, as President Kunkel has pointed out, no one else is doing. You can blog from your kitchen table and your pajamas, but there's no substitute, and have great opinions about the events of the day, but there's no substitute for that person who's there actually reporting on what's going on.
I think that you're going to see several things. I mean, the only thing we know for sure is people always are going to want to know what's going on, especially in their media environment, and people are going to figure out a way to make money around it. I think organizations, newsroom like John's, the Green Bay Press Gazette, will be there because they have a core expertise and a history and a tradition and a trust with the community. So in other words, providing information to the people of Green Bay about what's going on is something in one way or another. I think in 10 years they will be doing that, but I think you'll see it supplemented by community initiatives. I'm fairly confident by then it'll be almost entirely virtual or digital. You will have seen a continued meshing with broadcast and radio and that kind of thing. I think at the national level and international level, you probably will start to see some nonprofits, foundations. You might even see the government in kind of a PBS model start to put some money into sort of investigative journalism or national watchdog journalism, because I just think there's going to be so much pressure, to do this high-level journalism that we're going to have to find new models for that.
In fact, in the state of Wisconsin, the group has just announced the formation of a foundation-funded nonprofit investigative journalism center that's going to be headquartered at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And so that will be really interesting to see how that works. Sure. I think that's one model. I also think you'll see citizens, everyday citizens, serving a much greater role in reporting on what's happening at the neighborhood level, and will be one of our roles. I think will be to serve as a host or a gathering point for people to share that information. So that's yet another piece of that puzzle. Is readers will participate much more than they may have done so in the past.
Curious to know if a couple of newspaper pros would give kudos to any non-newspaper bloggers out there.
I would every day. We get important feedback from online viewers who can post blogs on our website, and it's much more raucous. Some of our viewers, online viewers, really dislike the language and the sarcasm and those kinds of things. But I think just about all of them are valuable because they offer some insights or some comments on the news. And those are the ones I see all of the time. I know there are bloggers at the national and international level, and I just unfortunately don't get enough time to to spend a lot of time looking at those. But I do know they're getting increasing credit for having an impact on public policy, and politicians are aware of them. They read them, and so I do think it adds to this symphony of voices that's out there, and it's an important element, a modern day element to what's going on.
I mean, I'm an old newspaper guy, but the website I probably turn to the most on a regular, ongoing basis is just CNN.com, just to kind of keep an eye on what's going on, and things like the Huffington Post, which is a melange of sort of old-style media but new-style blogging, and the mixture of opinion and reporting, I think, can demonstrate that new media, multimedia, can be done in an entertaining but responsible fashion. It's a wonderful new world out there. I think, I wish I was 20 again for all sorts of reasons, but not least of which, if I was going into journalism, I think it would be a great time, because those kids can actually decide what journalism is going to be in their lifetime. That's not something that when John was 20 could do, or I could do. And so it's tremendously liberating, as long as you accept that it ain't ever going to stop changing.
Right.
And that's a little scary to me and other folks of the newspaper age, but for that next generation, it can be very liberating.
One thing, final thought I'd add is that change has always been a part of this industry. When I started more than 30 years ago, stories were cast a letter at a time in hot type and linotype machines, and the means of creating that news and getting it onto paper have changed multiple times in that time, and now we see handhelds that deliver text messages, and you have to write a 5-word story. So that change has always been constant, and it may seem to people like me to accelerate at a faster pace, but it's always been a part of what we've done, and things have always changed. So the paper that used to come to you once a week or once a month delivered by Stagecoach,
sure,
it's now coming at you 24/7. And so I would also caution people to think about this, and that this change will always continue. And 20 years from now, someone will be trying to predict what the next new technological development is.
Right.
And that will never stop.
Good news. People always ask for more of it, and you read it on the posts with the Press Gazette. What are the positive stories? I read it on a lot of different papers. But do they support it with their wallets?
They do in key moments of the community. One of our big advertising revenue generators recently was on the commissioning of the USS Green Bay. We did a special section about that. That's hometown journalism at its finest. It's drawing the connection between this big Navy ship, transport ship, in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and advertisers wanted to be part of that message, and it did really well for us. And we've sent one team of reporter and photographer to California last week, and we have another team there now covering that. So in that sense, it does sell. But I also have to say our single copy sales skyrocket on disasters, on fires, and those kinds of things. And so the people who complain about that usually are the ones who've read it and then get a sense of outrage about it. But so I think both things work. Good news does sell when it's important to the lives of the person who's buying the paper. But disasters also sell, and you can tell that just watch the people at the convenience store and see which newspaper they pick up when they're getting their cup of coffee in the morning.
Sure.
Yeah.
Anything to add on that, Tom?
No, it's just that people are funny. I always used to think that they dealt with media the same way they deal with politics. They like to say they hate all politics, but they keep sending back their own representative. And they despise the media, but they tend to be very supportive and loyal to their local media, and they like the reporters and editors that they encounter. And I think in the main, people should know that the quality of journalism here and in most places remains very, very high. But they should also be aware that this is a very difficult pass that we're at with the media, and that they have a stake in it. That's the important thing. This is not something that is happening in a vacuum. And there are going to be real ramifications to whatever the next news environment looks like. There will be absolutely social, cultural, and governmental implications for all of us. So people need to pay attention.
Well, I have several other questions, but unfortunately our half hour is up already.
That's how fast it went. But I appreciate you both being here. Enjoyed it.
Thanks, Mike.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Tom. Join us next month as we continue to explore the world of ideas. I'm Mike Counter, sitting in for your host, Michael Marsden. Thanks for watching Conversations from St. Norbert College.